exciting. I mean, we've all talked about the synergy that's happening with Serenbe, not just the people moving here, but the people that are dropping in. And this is just kind of one of those nice days, few days. I mean, here we have Jennifer Walsh with Walk with Walsh back there in the back, in from New York City. And next to her is Terry with Outer Furniture, a brand new company, in from San Francisco. They're coming from both coasts. And of course, Pete Dominic, if you all remember Pete, in from New York with us, and all here to hear Richard Louv. So here are all these people who were great folks in their own worlds and their own poetry, and they're all happen to be at Serenbe today. Isn't that incredible? With all of you, there's some incredible people from Planet Hollywood. Here you've got Captain Planet, I mean. Here you've got everything happening next week, and you came out to hear Richard Louv tonight, and so many folks. So it's so exciting. Well, I'm here to the pleasure of introducing you to one of my heroes and huge in this entire world, because sometimes there's people that you feel have kind of reading your mind or put it out there, and I think Rich is one of those. We had the weekend place, and then in 1994 we moved our whole family out here, because in those 3 years that we came on the weekends, we saw the difference in our children and in us when we were able to connect with natural nature in an unscheduled way. And then several years later, in what, 2005, Rich was the book? Rich writes a book, Last Child in the Woods. And it was not his first book. If any of you go back to the history, he's got some interesting history in his books. In fact, he wrote America 2, and if you know what we're doing with Serenbe, it's really like he really was reading my mind, or we were tapping into the same energy fields of force. But anyhow, that's a whole other story. But so when the book came out, a couple people actually bought me the book, because they thought I was crazy when we were leaving Ansley Park and all those things that we thought were important, and we came out here in the woods. And then all of a sudden this man starts explaining what we've done, so people are not thinking I'm crazy anymore, right? And so I sent Rich a little note, and I said, thanks for giving voice to what we intuitively knew but couldn't explain. And so he did an entire book about that. And of course, Rich responded, and very nice. And then one of Rich's started a movement. Well, I should say his book enlivened so many people that they started a movement. And that was the Children in Nature network and gathering that they had. And it was a nonprofit, so one of the staff people, I think, oh my gosh, Rich, you got this note from this developer. Oh, we don't know any developers. I bet they could give us some money. Why don't we invite him to the gathering? And so, you know, I arrived with all these camp leaders and teachers and granola folks, and here I was, the developer showing me. So I was kind of that oddball at first. And of course, I was seeing Rich here and there, and finally they said, why don't you sit next to Rich with lunch? So that was the beginning of what's developed to a great friendship. I ended up going on the board, and as Children in Nature now is an international company, and I just stepped down from 2 years as being chair. Now, at our conference in, gosh, was that the conference in
Vancouver?
Vancouver, wasn't it? So in Vancouver, I'm headed to our national conference in Vancouver, and Monica always gives me my prep sheets on what I should do, and she said, the guy emceeing the conference this year is this incredible, intelligent, thoughtful, funny guy, Pete Dominic. Be sure to talk to him. Okay, so I kept trying to get up next to Pete. He was too busy, you know. And it just, you know.
It's all important.
Finally, I forget what I said, and finally Pete looked at me in the eye. I said, why don't you bring your family down and see us? And so Pete has now been here. This is your what? You're 2 times for a week with the family. Third visit.
It's my first time without my family, so it's a little sad.
Is that what it is?
It's to be here without them.
Yeah.
I want them with me.
So you see, he could give, you know, I could give that endearing, you know, I think Rich is this power person. But it'd be fun to hear Rich's more humorous, probably, take. Is it going to be humorous?
Maybe.
Maybe. So, I'm going to pass. This is a double introduction. You see, Rich is such a great guy that he gets a double introduction. So I get to now
oh, that's awesome.
to Pete to give the real introduction of
Yeah.
Richard Louv.
Give it up for the man who I wish would finally adopt me. What will it take, sir? Thank you all for coming out. We are excited to have you here. I did actually write something. I'm a stand-up comedian. I hate to read something, but this is one of probably my favorite writer, and I wrote it on the plane down here, so I don't know if it's any good. I read Last Child in the Woods for the first time when I was in Sicily visiting my wife's family who lives there in this beautiful kind of countryside. They call it Campagna for country. Last Child in the Woods changed my life in a profound way. While I was reading it, I knew I had him scheduled on my Sirius XM national radio show. I knew I'd be interviewing him, so I was reading it knowing I'd be interviewing him. And I just didn't know that the book was going to change me in such a profound way, but it changed me in a way, because I had a real appreciation for nature. I grew up in upstate New York, but it changed me in my parenting. My girls at that point were 7 and 5 years old, our girls. We were growing up in the suburbs of New York City, where nature is plentiful, but not quite like where I grew up in the wilds of upstate New York's Finger Lake region. And when I was reading Rich's new book, Our Wild Calling, which hopefully you've got, I was filled with so many, as if you've started reading it, so many memories of my own experience with living things that aren't human. In one part, Rich writes about a woman, so many great anecdotes in this book, a woman in the UK who watched these ants move a tiny piece of an apple. We've all probably done that. These ants moving this tiny piece of an apple for hours. And how it had such a profound effect on her perspective of her own universe. And it reminded me of the honeybee of Sicily. During that trip to Sicily, Last Child in the Woods made me look more closely at my natural surroundings than I had in years, and do more to point it out loud to my girls. At that time, I was thinking a lot about my next steps in my career, how I could turn radio into TV, and it seemed possible, but I knew it would be challenging. And I'm walking down the driveway in Sicily, in the countryside here, and as I did in most mornings, and I stopped, because I saw this bee trying to pollinate flowers, I think that's what they do. And it's probably he, right? Flew from blossom to blossom, drinking up that sweet Sicilian pollen, until he got to one that was really tightly closed, this flower. And I watched as he kept trying to get in its tightly closed petals, and for what seemed like a few minutes at least, I thought, this bee's got to move on. This is a dumb bee. Stupid fucking bee. Excuse my language. I just said, you're not getting in there. You're not getting in there, this bee. Those petals were closed tighter than Melania Trump's bedroom door. I thought that would get a bigger laugh. I'm not sure where I am. I don't know the audience. She's got her own room. I'm telling you, I know that. I have insiders. But that bee kept trying, and I kept watching, and now I was just starting to think, this is a dumb bee. There were so many other flowers that were open, and they were waiting. Move on, bee. There's no opening. Until there was. Suddenly, he was feasting in the bounty of that bright red Sicilian blossom. And I was dumbfounded, and I was impressed, and I was embarrassed for my own ignorance and lack of faith in what that bee knew that I did not. I'm currently in this interesting transition in my career after losing the best gig I ever had. And people say lots of things, encouraging things, positive things, when one door closes, or a window opens, or the squeaky wheel gets the oil. But I prefer to think about the honeybee of Sicily. And upon reading Rich's new book, so many more doors and windows have opened in my mind. I started reading this book when I was on a business trip, and I came home. I saw my dog in a different way. Now, I'm her favorite. I think it's because of how manly and masculine I am. I don't know why you're laughing at this. But when I walked through the door, she was much more excited to see me than my wife and my daughters were. But this time, I was just as excited to see her. I was just as excited to accommodate her enthusiasm for my return. Normally, I greet her, and then I tell her to calm down and back off. This time, I lied down on the floor with her, and I let her jump all over me. And I decided, as Rich wrote about a little boy in his book, that my heart was gone. It was now in this dog. All of Rich's work has taught me so much more than I thought I ever knew about nature. But more than anything, Rich's work has taught me more than what I thought I knew about myself. This man has changed my life. He is a mentor. He is a friend. But I'm in this tough transition where I just lost my job. And as I'm reading this book, I realize I'm completely enthralled, and I'm as happy as I've been in months. Ladies and gentlemen, one of my favorite writers, Richard Louv.
Well, we can all go back and I'll sign books. I mean, how do you follow that? First, Pete is a great guy. I'm proud to call him my friend. Steve has been a hero of mine for a long time. I mean, I like to say that there's two kinds of people in the world, people who do and people who write about people who do, and I'm the latter, and that's not false modesty. I feel I'm more of a cheerleader than anything for people I admire. And first let me tell you the full story that Pete hinted at. It's a woman I write about in the early part of Our Wild Calling, and she's a wonderful woman. She's living in Toronto then. She walks into her living room. She had a 6-year-old son and a big dog named Jack. And she walks in and she sees her 6-year-old son stretched out on the carpet and Jack stretched out next to him, the dog. And her son's arm is around the dog. And she hears her son say, "I don't have a heart anymore." And she says, "What are you saying?" And her son said, "My heart is in Jack." That, I think, captures pretty well this permeability that is between us as humans sometimes, and is also between us and other animals. I was telling Pete that this is the hardest book that I've written. I worked on it for 4 years. I did do another book, a paperback book, the Vitamin N, the 500, one of those kind of books, 500 Things You Can Do. And I did that book not because I like those kind of books, but because I finally decided that people kept telling me they needed a list of suggestions, and so it's a list of suggestions. But most of that 4 years of writing was spent researching and writing Wild Calling. And I told Pete, as I've told others, don't ever start a book based on a feeling. I've made that mistake before. But this definitely was a feeling that I could not explain. It was a feeling that I had to recollect. I had to remember experiences that I had had with animals that didn't make sense at the time, because I vaguely remembered that feeling. And then I started having more experiences with animals and realizing that's the feeling. And what the little boy described, "My heart is in Jack," that is the feeling. The book is filled with stories that people have told me or sent me about those transcendent moments, those often life-changing moments with another animal. Sometimes it's a companion animal, sometimes it's a wild animal. There's a lot of research, or at least more than there was, on domestic animals because of animal-assisted therapy, which is really gaining in popularity quickly. There's very little research on how wild animals affect us. in terms of our psychological health, our physical health, our spiritual health. And in fact, much of the research on children in nature, which we've accumulated at the Children Nature Network, and it's gone, by the way, from about 60 studies I could find when I wrote Last Child in the Woods to probably now over 1,000 studies. And we have abstracts of those studies on the Children in Nature Network website. It's the one place in the world you can go and find out about that research, the majority of it. We pulled it out from behind the firewalls, which is a whole issue that I think needs to be looked at. Firewalls being you have to pay a bunch of money to read an article that was paid, the research was paid for, often by a public university, paid for by the public, and yet we have to pay. In any case, we've pulled it out so it's available to people so they can go to their school board and make the case for nature-based education or nature-based learning environments, that kind of thing. But what I realize is that almost all of that research on the benefits of nature to child and human development are about green space. Now there's the assumption that that green space contains some critters, but the specific implications of those animals, wild animals, on our existence has not been looked at very closely at all. Much of the book is about domesticated animals, companion animals, but most of the animals mentioned in the book are wild animals. So these stories that I've collected, I think, illustrate the impact in a way that the research has yet to prove. So these stories were from all kinds of people, from hardcore scientists, from teachers, from kids, from adults, from people in different nations of different races, different economic groups, inner city, rural, and they tended to have common denominators. Let me start by telling you another one of those stories. From Paul Dayton. He's an oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He's a great guy. I think he's just entered his 80s. And he told me about how when he was younger, he was on the bottom of the ocean one day looking for samples. And he felt something very large, he could sense it, come over him and then stop. That's usually not a good sign. And he kind of looked up slowly and he saw one tendril come down, and then another tendril come down. And then he looked up and he says, one of those really big octopuses with a 12-foot wingspan. And he said, you know, risking anthropomorphism, that terrible, terrible thing. He said, it decided I was a clam. And it came down and got me. And it did. And it wrapped him up in its arms, in its tentacles, hard. He says, people think those tentacles are soft. They're not. They're hard. You cannot budge them. And these tentacles are very interesting because they have much of the brains of the octopus are independently in the arms of the octopus. So these arms have brains of their own. They also have, the skin is filled with photons, the things that help us see. Now, I'm not sure it was seeing Paul, but it was certainly getting to know him really well. And he couldn't budge him. About this time, he realizes he's running out of oxygen in his tank. And he does this thing that prey, the gazelle, often does in the mouth of the lion. He relaxed, just instinctively. He remembers doing that. And the octopus relaxed just a little bit. And he kicked off the bottom of the ocean with the last strength that he had, running out of oxygen. And they slowly, both of them, start going up in the column of water, higher and higher, higher. The octopus is still around him. I love telling this story because I love seeing people in audiences squirm. And they're going up and up. And as they're going up and up, he feels the octopus coming around his body, and he feels the razor-sharp beak of the octopus coming around his neck. Doesn't cut him, it's just coming around his neck until he's looking into the eye of the octopus. About that time, they both broke the surface, hit the top, and the octopus goes down a little bit underneath the surface and stays there, and Paul rips off his mask, gasps for breath, and is looking, still has eye contact with the octopus just underneath the surface. The best part is next. What does Paul do? He puts on the mask, and watching the octopus disappear into the darkness, he chases it down. He goes after the octopus. I said, Paul, why the hell would you do such a thing? He says, I don't know. I don't know. I just had to do it. And he, as a hard-edged, serious, highly respected scientist, he said there was something spiritual that happened. And he just had to do that. He didn't want to let that moment go, for one thing. Why did he do that? That's part of the question, one of the questions of the book, in a larger sense. Why would somebody do that? Another story. This is my own brief story. I was on a lake in my boat. I have an electric motor, and it's very quiet. And I was out there alone one morning, and it was a beautiful early morning. And on the shore, I saw what I thought were two vultures eating a dead, what looked like a carp. And so with my electric motor, I eased up closer to them, closer and closer, got within about 20 feet, and realized they were not vultures. They were two really large golden eagles. You don't get within 20 feet of golden eagles usually. And so for a long time, I'm going to put an asterisk on that, for a long time, because there's something about that long time thing. It seemed like a long time. We did this. Well, first, one of the eagles goes up around a point on a mountain and then comes back down. And so for a long time, the eagles would do this. They would go down, take a bite of the carp, and then look up at me. And then go down, take another bite, and look up at me. And this eye contact thing, back and forth, went on for what seemed like forever. Now, it wasn't forever. The stories, one of the common denominators of the stories that people have told me is that they enter altered states during certain encounters with other animals. One of those altered states is time either disappears or bends. Another altered state is like you mentioned about the ants. If you get down, it's an altered state where your sense of space is altered by your encounter with another animal. And there are others. So for me, it was this altered space of time. And during those moments, something happened, kind of like what Paul described. Something happened. And I can't speak for the eagles. They may have just been trying to decide if I was edible. But something happened, and it wasn't just in me. It was between us. So I went home, and my younger son was home from college, and he's the one that I knew had the fishing gene, because when he was 3, I caught him fishing in the humidifier. True story, and he did pretty well. I said, Matthew, I told him the story. He said, it's the weirdest thing, you know. I felt something shift there. I said in so many words, Matthew, whoever I say I am, I'm not. Whoever I was in those moments is who I actually am, and I don't have the words to describe it. This is beyond human language. This is beyond verbal language. Later, I read an essay by the great philosopher, intellectual Martin Buber. I have to always be careful not to say Justin Bieber. And Buber wrote this great essay called I and Thou. And he was talking about people. And basically he said, you and I don't exist. What exists is right here, is between us. It's a relationship. Now, he was speaking of relationship in a slightly different way than most of us do. He believed that this relationship, this thing between two people, is a kind of electricity that some people call God. He applied that to people. And I thought, you know, that's kind of what I was feeling with those golden eagles. That's what that little boy felt with his dog. That's what Paul felt with the octopus. Something like that. And so in the book, I realized that there's no name for that. There's no, and I looked in other religions and I couldn't really find a good phrase for that. So in the book, I call that the habitat of the heart between us. And I believe that there are basically two habitats. One is the physical habitat that we work very hard to protect, as we should. The other habitat is the habitat of the heart. And we don't do nearly as much as we should to preserve and protect that between us and non-human animals and other life forms, including plants. We don't do enough on that. And if one of those habitats goes, so does the other. I think the habitat of the heart is missing today in much of environmentalism. And that's one of the reasons we're not doing so well these days, or as well as we should be. That's not a critique of environmentalism, it's a critique of myself too. I mean, it's a critique of society. We have forgotten what our ancestors knew, assumed, didn't need studies to prove. What I found is the best way to talk about that is through stories that people tell. Long ago, our ancestors gathered at the end of the day around fires and they told animal stories. And sometimes they acted out with their bodies these stories. And they would become the bear in the telling of these stories. And these stories took on great meaning, even if they didn't start with meaning, okay? They took on great meaning. We tell stories today, and I think this is actually a good thing, around an electronic campfire. All those YouTube videos of animals. And the predominance of animals of different species that get along. I think that's significant. I think that's saying a couple things. It's saying that we want that in our world. We want that with each other. We want that with people that are not like us, racially or economically. We want that with other animals too. And that's an expression of that. So I don't really laugh at the people who do that. I think that's great. I think it would be even greater if we told those stories around kitchen tables and dining tables and in living rooms. And as we told them, they took on deeper meaning. And that's what the book is about, I think, ultimately, is about the meaning we find in our relationships with other animals. One of the themes, and I'll say this part more quickly so that we can have more of a discussion, which is the part I enjoy more than my own sermonette. One of the themes is human loneliness. Medical folks are now saying that loneliness, social isolation, is about to outpace obesity as a cause of early death. They're not just talking about suicide. They're talking about all kinds of diseases they're finding are associated with social isolation, human loneliness. During those moments with the eagles, there was absolutely no way in the universe that I could feel lonely. When people have these experiences, all of that goes away. Even if it's just a few seconds, it's gone. And they are connected, and they are in the world, they are in the universe, in the habitat of the heart. In the book, I talk about species loneliness, that I think our human loneliness is rooted in an even deeper loneliness, and that's our sense of separation from the rest of nature. The deeper we go into that species loneliness, the more pathological our species becomes. And our way back to each other, sometimes, not always, is ironically, possibly through the eyes of our dog, or through the experience of the coyote who runs through our yard and stops for just a second and has eye contact with us. There's a guy in the Bay Area named John Young I write about who teaches bird language to people. He'll take large groups of people into the woods and he shows them the patterns and the sounds, not only the sounds but the patterns, the behaviors that communicate, that birds use to communicate not only with each other but with other species too. Squirrels know alarm sounds that birds make and they react to those appropriately, and vice versa. There is a kind of whisper that's going on all around us all the time of animal communication and tree communication and plant communication too. There's a lot of science now that's suddenly coming forth that shows that this is true. And it's always there, and we don't hear it because we don't listen, we don't pay attention. When John Young teaches bird language, he notices that many of the people who have learned this, and by the way, I put this in the category of what I call the oldest language, that is pre-verbal. It's small behaviors, it's eye movements, it's all kinds of things we do unconsciously that we've done since before we could talk, since before our species could talk, or at least talk well. And that is shared by many species, so that's why I call it the oldest language. He says people who take bird language often go home and they realize that they're getting along better with their spouse than they ever did. And it turns out it's because they're listening to their spouse. So these animals bring us together, and we owe them something in return for that. At the end of the book, and maybe later tonight I'll find that paragraph and read it, is something called the Reciprocity Principle. We need to give back to them what they give to us. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a conversation. Please, somebody say, I just spoke to 1,200 students at East Carolina University in a big auditorium, and it took a long time for one of them to raise their hand. Yes. Yeah. So you and by the way, you came how many hours, drove how many hours? 5 hours, did you say? To be here tonight. I so appreciate that.
So I've done a lot of work on environmental protection in Florida, and then the more recent 18-month ban of what the family's doing here at Serenbe. But you mentioned in the very beginning about don't ever write a book based on an idea. And
on a feeling.
If you could, or feeling, excuse me.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could ascribe what kind of box that looked like and whether you achieved it in your mind.
Like I say, it's the hardest book I've written. You know, writers are walking vessels of self-doubt. So I hope I did. I hope I did. And people like Joe, in the last week or so since it came out, have told me I did. So I hope they're right.
Was it more towards...
I trust you, Joe. I really do.
Was it the habitat of the heart was the idea? Or what was the nugget that you were trying
Habitat of the Heart describes that, but I wasn't there yet. It was just this feeling. And it was a feeling I had with my dog Banner. I talk about Banner quite a bit, and it's interesting because some of the reviewers keep talking about Banner. Banner was a collie, and there's a picture of him in the book with me. I'm standing there holding a walkie-talkie, which is actually an early iPhone. I'm about that tall. And Banner was, of course, a very special dog. All pets are very special, but Banner really was. I I don't laugh at Lassie, you know. You know, Timmy's caught in the well. I never liked Timmy that much. I like Jeff, the one that came. Jeff I could relate to. He got in trouble. And, you know, he's in the well, and Lassie, go home, save him. Well, my dog did that. I fell through the ice once down the creek. We spent a lot of time in the woods together. My parents didn't know where I was, but Banner did. And one time I went through the ice. I was up to about here in the ice. And that was, you'd think I could get out, except there were these steep banks in the creeks, kind of like the creeks you have here. This is in the Midwest. And it snowed, and the more I tried to get out, the icier and slicker it got, so I couldn't get out. So I look up, and Banner's disappeared, of course, because Banner went home. Every time I got in trouble, my mother would know I was in trouble because Banner shows up. But he came back. And I admit in the book that memory is tricky, and that it's possible that I've romanticized what happened. But I am really cold, and I don't know what's going to happen. And then I see Banner's head at the top. And then my next part of the memory is I'm on one end of a long stick that wasn't there before, and he's on the other. And I'm climbing out. Memory's tricky. I may have made him into Lassie in my mind. I don't know. I don't think I did, though. And he did other things that I won't go into in the neighborhood that were quite remarkable in how he treated dogs and cats that he hated, but he would protect our cat, even though he hated it. And how he would react when another dog, a small dog, was being picked on. This is in the days when there were no fences in the neighborhood. Dogs chased cars. Remember that, anybody? And they ran up and down, and they got in dog fights. And Banner, clearly to me, had a set of ethics. And I said one time that this to an animal behavioralist, that I thought that Banner taught me some ethics. And he said, no way, you're anthropomorphizing the dog. And I still thought, no, he did. And as I was doing the research for the book, so that feeling you're talking about is that feeling I had with Banner, very similar to the little boy with his arm around Jack. When I was doing the research, I ran across some German research. All dogs are descended from gray wolves. And there's one theory that we domesticated gray wolves by throwing bones outside the fire, and they came closer, and pretty soon, you know, they got to know us, and we got to know them, and all that. The other theory is that they domesticated us. Probably both are true. Probably we co-evolved, co-became. But these German academics were writing about wolves, and they said it's possible that early people followed the packs of wolves. And rather than the wolves, or in addition to the wolves coming in and getting the scraps we would throw out, we picked up the scraps that they left, the carcasses and all that. And we watched them. We watched how cooperative they were and collaborative, and that they hunted together. And we watched their families from a distance and realized what good families they are. And so these German researchers say that it's possible that we learned ethics, some ethics from them. They actually use the word ethics. I don't know if that's true, you know. Nobody does. Nobody will, because nobody left a written record. But it rings true in that thousands of years later, 30,000 years later, that Banner would exhibit some of those ethics, and that I noticed, because at that time of my life, I needed to notice that.
So, toward the beginning, you mentioned nurturing the habitat of the heart, and that one of the things that was missing in our environmentalism is that nurturance of the habitat for the heart. What is that conversation, and how? What are some of the hows, or what would that look like?
Well, let me read you that. Could I borrow my book?
Yes, you may.
Thanks. Let me find something to read, because I'm maybe more articulate when I read this than I would be. Our times call for the adoption of a basic principle that embraces both survival and joy. We might call this the Reciprocity Principle. For every moment of healing that humans receive from another creature, humans will provide an equal moment of healing for that animal and its kin. For every acre of wild habitat we take, we will preserve or create at least another acre for wildness. For every dollar we spend on classroom technology, we will spend at least another dollar creating chances for children to connect deeply with another animal, plant, or person. For every day of loneliness we endure, we will spend a day in communion with the life around us until the loneliness passes away. That's where the book led me, to that.
Do you think that, like,
I'll keep it here for a minute.
yeah, that there's a kind of, so as we, there's a lot of stuff that we do with the idea of fighting for, and with this you kind of can't fight something and create what you're talking about, this communion with nature, and this, is there a kind of, when you have one of those experiences with an animal, and like you say in the beginning of the book, like we've all had them. We've had them with wild animals, or we've had them with our own animals. You can't judge yourself in those moments. Like in that moment, you can't judge yourself. You can't judge anything around. There's no judgment. There's no fear. All of that stuff disappears. Do you think that that part of what we're going to have to become in order to be able to be this is actually to have less judgment, or to have more caring for ourselves, to have more, what do you?
That's a great question, and I struggled with that question. I mean, we live in a time, particularly right now, in which everything is measured in litmus tests and check-off boxes. And you have to check off all the boxes, and you have absolutely to be perfect. You know, otherwise you'll get attacked. And life is more complex than that, but there are people at both ends of the spectrum who insist on purity, whatever is defined as pure this month. And it's making life miserable for a lot of people. So one of those issues, and it touches on this, is how people deal with animals. Some people fish, some people hunt, some people are vegans. You know, there's a lot of judgment going around about that. So I wrote a passage, and so I went, we moved to a small town recently, and the library asked me to talk. So I read this passage and asked them, should I put it back in? And at the end of it, they were all saying put it back in. And they came from different spectrums politically. So if I could read that, I'd appreciate it.
Where are you, please?
Pardon me? Page 251. This sounds like a Bible, doesn't it? Go to 251 and Joe will lead the sermon, will lead the chorus. Human behavior is ruled not so much by law or even culture as it is by spirit, and by a natural cycle that begins and ends all debates. Our arguments about hunting and fishing and animal husbandry and tofu made of soybeans harvested from the land where wildlife meets its end under the tilling blade, all of that confusing, overlapping, endless circling around one another with suspicion, superiority, and sometimes humility. In this debate, we might think about reframing the taking of life when it involves providing ourselves, our families, and our communities with the food necessary for survival. We might think about this exchange as trading life. By that I mean that when we eat other beings, we are trading their lives for ours. We will live, yes, but sooner or later, even as ashes, our bodies replenish the endless chain of food and desire, fruition and life, death and decay, to be risen again and again and again. Perhaps this is the ultimate meaning of reciprocity and communion. Having described the biological reality of life, still dominated by tooth and fang, we also know that our species has more freedom to choose than most. In small ways, in ways small and large, we can move away from mindless consumption and beyond single lifespan concerns. We do not require encouragement to trade life for life. Rather, we need a center that holds true to a philosophy of compassion and thoughtfulness. There is our spirit and the call. That's the best I could work out, the contradictions. Yes.
So to follow up on that, have you had a lot of the conversations, it seems like, that we tend to have about people and animals focus on either pets or wildlife? But there is that whole enormous group of animals that are traditionally raised for food. And without not having read the book yet, have you had any of those types of experiences with animals, quote unquote, food animals, and has that changed your perspective on anything? Because as I heard you read that, when you say they were necessary for survival, it's really not. I haven't eaten meat in 35
Remember, I mentioned plants in there too.
Yes, but there's a big difference between plants and animals.
There is, but animals die when we harvest plants.
True.
And I'm not making an argument against
But
veganism,
in terms
understand?
of the direct relationship, I'm going to eat this particular animal that I've never met, never had an experience with.
Yeah, I don't.
And most of the time go out of the way not to have any experience with. I'm just curious what your experience.
Well, first we met some great bulls down here, including one that had a crush on our photographer, I think. There are people in the book who tell stories about farm animals, and they're complicated. They have relationships with animals on the farms, and sometimes those relationships end in ways that aren't nice for the animal. I don't make the argument for veganism or against it. I don't make the argument for eating animals or against it, or hunting or any of that. I think we have to pull back from those arguments to a degree. Ultimately, we have to, it's getting a lot harder for me to fish. Okay, I've grown up fishing. The bond I have with my younger son is about fishing. But it's getting tougher for me to fish. It is not black and white to me. But I would like us to have a conversation as a culture that pulls back from those specifics and looks at our love for other life. We'll get to those specifics. And like I say, there are people here that, in the book, that talk about farm animals and talk about their relationship. Now, it's clear in the book that factory farming is not my favorite thing. But I think there's a larger conversation that needs to be inclusive of people who don't agree. We don't have to agree on everything to try to make things better for ourselves and for other animals. Philip? I have a feeling you don't agree with me.
No, but you based a lot of your. I mean, you've had all these revelations based on experiences with your dog.
Yeah.
And yet there are cultures who eat dogs.
Yeah, and I talk about that.
You haven't had that yet.
I talk about that in the book. Yeah. And notice that last paragraph, though, that I did add on, which is we do have choices.
Okay.
We can make a choice.
But aren't those choices aren't those choices based on our experiences? Like if you would never hurt your dog because you've had a relationship with your dog, but you don't have the same qualms, or not you personally, I just meant anybody. People base their actions on their experiences with that particular species, even if it's not that particular individual. So
there are a lot of
something that you think. Do you think people avoid? Would you guess maybe that people avoid having those experiences because it would require them to make a choice that they hadn't thought about before.
Like I say, I'm having trouble fishing these days. I wrote a book about fishing called Fly Fishing for Sharks, and I went all over America to fish with Americans in order to write about Americans. Many different fishing cultures. And I have a chapter, and it kept bothering me, your question. And I have a chapter near the end, this was in 1990, no, in 2000. I have a chapter near the end about the ethics of fishing and about fish and pain. At that time, what the science was saying is that fish don't, they feel something like pain, but the part of the brain that interprets pain as suffering is missing in fish. That was what the science was saying then. And so you had to be careful when you talked about pain to know what exactly you were talking about, because fish are different from us. We have the part of the brain that interprets you know, a splinter as deep pain. Things have changed since then. The science has changed, and the science is now saying it's more on the side of the people who say there's pain as something like what we know it, that fish do experience. This is kind of a moving target. Having said that, how many of the streams in America are preserved because of fishermen? Who is watching the streams? You know, who notices when there's a fish kill? Who notices when there's an oil slick moving down a beautiful trout stream? Who defends them from being dammed? And then who plants them in many of the lakes? Fish that would not exist if people weren't involved with fishing. It's not an argument for fishing, it's just saying that these things are complicated. And I don't pretend to have the final litmus test on what's right and wrong in that. I think people do pretty much their best. I've grown more and more careful about how I fish. I don't use barbed hooks. I tend to catch and release. Even that has real moral. I dealt with that in that book. Animal rights folks call that torture and release, and they make a very good case. So I'm very careful when I torture and release that I don't use barbed hooks that are easy to take out. There's a thing called a circle hook that they won't, very unlikely to swallow. And I don't play them for a long time because that builds up lactic acid and they will die later, even if they look okay when you let them loose. Having said that, even in the earlier book, I came to the conclusion that the only truly moral way to fish was the way my New Mexico former communist, now Christian literalist, farmer woodworker friend in New Mexico, who taught me to fly fish, fishes. He and his wife will go up in the mountains and they'll fish just enough to eat that day, and they stop. They just stop, even if it's just an hour of fishing. You know, that thing about trading life, we will someday feed that stream ourselves with our bodies. And it takes a long time. It's in slow motion, this sense of justice. And that's the best I can do at this point. Maybe I'll get smarter later, but I have thought about these things a lot.
So Last Child in the Woods, and I know you realized this years later and saw the impact of it on school teachers and their ability to take that book and kind of make themselves advocates with school districts for outside curricula that we were talking about earlier. I was curious if, I know it's early in the book tour, but I'm curious if you have been surprised or pleased by an audience that's responding to this that you didn't necessarily intend when you wrote it.
An audience, I think it's too early for that, probably. I did intend for Last Child in the Woods to affect teachers. I mean, I hoped it would, in schools and all of that. So this is a peculiar book. It's a little different from Last Child in the Woods. It's a lot more internal, and I've been told by a lot of people that it's a lot more emotional from me than the others were. And that's why it's scary, I have to tell you. You know. Yes.
How do you feel about culling deer to keep the herd healthy?
How do I feel about culling deer? And I know that has to happen here, or it's happening here apparently, in Serenbe. Boy, I couldn't shoot a deer. And that's part of the hypocrisy and contradiction of how we deal with animals. I can fish carefully, but I could never shoot a deer. And there, where we live, there's deer everywhere, and I love seeing them. I go out, I can see 8, 9, 10. One night I saw 40 deer on my 5-mile walk. And when they stop and look at me and their antennae go up, and we had that, you know, I swear, looking in their eyes, it's like I'm looking into another universe. Or it feels that way. And you know, I can't imagine. I don't think I'm ever going to get used to seeing those deer. Could I shoot one? No. But I do know that there are areas where deer, and I'm not big on caring a lot about whether they eat our roses, but they do push out other species. The overpopulation of one species can decimate another endangered species. One of the reasons that's such an important question is I have a section in the book called The Betweens. One of the ironies is that even in a time when we feel more nature deficit disorder, as I called it, than ever, there are more wild animals moving into cities than ever. The woods that I described had no deer. The deer in Kansas, basically, I was told by a ranger, there were no deer in 1948. They'd all been hunted out. Now, Kansas is filled with deer. It's also, they're seeing mountain lions come down the Missouri River across parts of northern, maybe in the neighborhood I grew up where I would have given anything to see a bobcat. And then on to St. Louis and maybe farther. And they're following the deer. But when any species becomes too dominant, and sometimes that's because of us, certainly hunting regulations make mountain lions more, and I'm glad about that because I love living around mountain lions. But also invasive species have a role to play with this. Deer do carry wood ticks, which I'm very conscious of now because of the diseases, Lyme disease and others that come with that. But there is an invasive particular plant. There are different kinds of non-indigenous plant cover that will spread through woods, and they will hide the mice that are kind of the original vectors of ticks that then jump on the deer and then jump on the leaves and then jump on us. That's hard to parse out as to what to do about the deer and the mice and maybe the invasive species. If we can get that, that'd be great. But the betweens, more than ever, cities are filling up to a degree with wild animals. There are coyotes in Central Park. There are great pictures of coyotes riding mass transit in Portland, Oregon. You know, raccoons have moved into cities in huge numbers. They prefer cities. And I hate the phrase trash pandas, you know, because I like raccoons. They were all over our house when we lived in town, in the small town. And I love their bad attitude. Now they race across our roof, and I'd go out and see them at night, big noise, and see a big mother raccoon, you know, standing up and going toward me. And I stood my ground behind the glass. And then it really got overboard when she flipped me off, you know. So I love the bad attitude. Now we live in a place, we're in a place with lots of acorn woodpeckers, and they're similar to the raccoons. They're very complex. They raise their kids communally. They have helpers and parents. They have this constant chatter, this complex language that they're using, and they chase everything off. I mean, even the big stellar jays, they're afraid of the little woodpeckers. Where am I going with that? As more wild animals move into cities, we're going to have to make some tough decisions about what to control, what not to control. Some of those animals are vectors for what are called zoonotic diseases that can be passed to us and from us to them. Some of those animals become rabid, not very many, but a few of them. One of the ideas in the book is not just to depend on the so-called professionals to help us figure that one out. But that maybe we should have something like neighborhood watch. But in the book I called it neighborhood wild watch, in which people form clubs at the neighborhood level where kids and parents and the retirees down at the corner get together and they agree to watch the animals, the wild ones and the domestic ones that are coming in. Notice which ones are new because of climate change and which ones have left because of climate change. There's going to be a lot of moving around now. But also notice which ones are sick and know who to report that to, which ones are aggressive, too aggressive. But also to teach their neighbors not to feed the wild animals. It's not good for the wild animals, it's not good for us. But also to enjoy, find joy in these animals and know what they are, know who they are, know how they're communicating. You know, that would be such an enrichment to so many neighborhoods if they did that. But they have to watch out for humans and they have to watch out for wild animals, or all animals. Did you?
I was just, your question's an interesting one. I don't know if you answered it in the book. I read it, remember it, but what is your opinion on the very controversial question of if we are an invasive species, and just to follow up, who in this room specifically? Who's the worst? Our population, humanity.
That's one of those big questions that is so large that I don't deal with it. You know, obviously, overpopulation is a huge issue. Having said that, I actually believe that cities can become engines of biodiversity. I think we're entering a period in which we're going to have to live with other animals and other life forms in new ways. You've heard the phrase the Anthropocene, you know, the age of man, as a geologic age that we're either in or entering. It depends on who you ask. I don't like that phrase because it's so human-centered. It's more of our egotism. It assumes that we're in charge of everything. E.O. Wilson calls that, he says the Anthropocene is actually not the age of man, it's the age of loneliness. Because it'll be down to a few people and some domesticated animals, and that's it, if we're not careful. A few weeks ago, there was a study released that said that almost 30% of birds in North America have disappeared just since 1970. About 3 billion birds. Some of that is because of climate change, some of that is because of habitat destruction, and some of it is because of our cats. So he calls that the age of loneliness. It's no accident, I don't know if I said this, but the urban parks with the highest benefit for human psychological health are the parks with the highest biodiversity. I don't think that's an accident. We are desperate not to feel alone in the universe. That is part of the source of religion. But it turns out that we are not alone in the universe. We're surrounded by intimacy. We're surrounded by that whisper all the time. We have a larger family that we belong to. And to the extent that we recognize and love that larger family, to the extent in the complicated ways that we struggle to come up to know what the right way to do that is, we are not alone in the universe. There's a guy named Glenn Albrecht. He, in Australia, is a philosopher, and I met him quite a few years ago. He coined the phrase solastalgia, which is this deep loneliness, deep homesickness that we feel when the environment around us that we love is being destroyed. It's a homesickness for a home that is being destroyed around us. Not for one we once had, but around us. He also talks about what he calls the symbiocene as an alternative to the Anthropocene. Symbiosis, living in symbiosis with other life. We have to learn how to do that. I think we're just at the beginning of that journey. And I've struggled with that and described that in some very crude ways because that's all I can manage. But this is the beginning of that journey, I think, to live with other life and to coexist. So maybe I should end now. Thanks.